Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and these two bins that you see right behind me are the bins that we're going to be working on today. As you can see from their labels, these systems have African nightcrawlers living in them. ANC is my abbreviation for African nightcrawlers. And today they're 1 year in service. So happy 1 year birthday. And on this day we're going to make a big effort to try to bring them to an end by hauling out the majority of the worms that live in these systems. 20 days ago we prepared for this, or started preparing for this, by setting up horizontal migration feeding zones over on these edges of the system. And we thought that 20 days may or may not be enough time for it to happen. We came back halfway through that time period, 10 days ago, to make sure that there was ample bedding, ample food in these systems to keep the process moving. And I did actually come in here 2 days ago to aerate the material, because to me it seems like aerating the material every so often sends the dry stuff on the surface down into the material, creating a drier environment overall, which I believe is a big motivation for the worms to want to exit the material. So I've got a couple new systems all set up for them right here on the bench. Yep, they're going to be moving into yellow buckets. And as you can see, these yellow buckets are equipped with quite a bit of material in them. And inside there, even below the bedding material, is some potato, coffee, so they got a little snack to nibble on when they arrive. So I'm going to get a glove on, and we're going to get this process started. Let's get to hauling out worms and launching off bins. You know, sometimes I worry about these worms within the material that are still stragglers, sort of holding out on making their way over into the collection area, because very often they just don't make it, you know. This poor little guy has kind of made its way out to the surface. Sometimes when you see a little bit of like fuzz, a little bit of fuzz developing, that looks to me like mold collecting on a deceased worm. Poor little guy. And I mean, that's something I don't really want to see have happening in, you know, my systems. I don't want to push the envelope so hard on forcing one of these migrations using the method of drying the material out to the point where it becomes hostile to the worms. But I'm always trying different things, and sometimes it does feel like some of the stuff that I'm doing is a bit harsh on the poor little wormies. So it's a bit unfortunate for the ones that get caught up in some of these more hazardous situations. But I figured we would, you know, I always tend to go to my left, which is bin number 2 from your perspective. Bin number 1 is here, so we'll start in bin number 1. Try to remind myself of the order of things, kind of reversed since it's being viewed from your perspective from the opposite side. So we'll start by doing the haul out of the worms that have managed over the past 20 days to collect over here in the collection area in bin number 1. I'm just trying my best to gather up the last of the little worms that I'm able to spot here and there, including a couple tiny ones that have sort of made themselves at home on this plastic here. I believe we've got them all. So I've got my haul out container here. We'll use this square one to haul out the contents of bin number 1's horizontal migration feeding zone. We'll use this round one to do the same over in bin number 2. So hopefully these containers are large enough to hold everything. My whole idea here was to simply scoop everything out, and I'll do what I usually do here, is I'll try to do so in a way that permits you as the viewer to get a good look at what's happening as I extract the contents of the horizontal migration feeding zone. Give you a little idea of just how many worms have come together, because I will be turning to you, the viewers, as I usually do when I'm launching new systems, to give me your input. So at the end I'll definitely be asking again. I'll ask over and over just as a reminder that you remember to give me your guess. You know, tell me how many worms you believe came together in this haul out, maybe more importantly, worm bin launch or worm bucket launch. Because I'll always take everyone's input, and then I'll just average everyone's guesses. So I'll take my own estimate for how many worms I believe were placed into a new system, and then I'll average it with what everyone else thought. And that'll give us our estimated worm count for my systems, and that's just the way I usually do it. And I guess in this case we're bringing a little chunk of pumpkin stem along for the ride. Something that just didn't happen to get consumed in its entirety while these systems were in service. So they'll just get to keep nibbling on that in their new home. So this is almost the entirety of our horizontal migration feeding zone for bin number 1. And I guess we'll just end up dropping the worms that used to live in bin number 1 over into bucket number 1. And similarly, we'll do the same with the contents or the hauled out worms from bin number 2. And we'll drop them into bucket number 2. So hopefully we've got everyone here. I don't plan on using these castings immediately. My plan with this material is to actually try to continue hauling out stragglers, because even a couple days ago when I was in here stirring the material around, aerating it, I still saw a fair number of worms hanging out within the material. Who knows, maybe over the past couple days since I did that, perhaps the worms have made their way over. I guess before we close the book on bin number 1 here, because I'll take care of resetting some sort of a baiting station or perhaps rebuilding the horizontal migration feeding zone. I'm never sure how I want to play it next, but it's usually not very interesting just to be plopping in some bedding and some food or setting up bait stations, so I'll usually leave that for off camera. But before we put bin number 1 aside, I'll typically want to kind of rummage through the material just to see how the stuff looks, and it looks like we've still got a few more worms right here on the perimeter that we can still haul out. Here we'll be bringing a little bit of the finished castings along for the ride, I suppose. I'm not that desperate for castings. I've got quite a bit of this stuff, so anytime I need any of this stuff out in the garden, I've always got an ample supply. But yeah, if any worms get left behind in this process, I will be making another attempt at trying to round up the stragglers, so we need not pick out every last one. I think we'll just leave it at that. I'll even usually hang on to this divider if it's holding up well enough, because I did puncture it full of little perforations all the way up to the top, so it could certainly serve as a divider here for one more round if we decided to go with the horizontal migration approach one more time. I do almost feel like I want to cover this material up and not let it further dry, because allowing it to further dry seems like it's just going to continue to make it more and more hostile for whatever worms are still living in the stuff. Look at that, we've still got so many worms. I mean, it's true that we're talking about worms right there on the edge, so perhaps we need to treat the edge as still requiring a little bit more haul out activity of the worms living there. So let's do it that way before we just explore the rest of the material. It does seem like worms that just tried to make it over and just didn't make it all the way over, but they should definitely be part of the haul out. And whatever ones we miss, we'll get them on the next go around. It's kind of like what I've got going on in my my other system. That other system over there behind me, you might have, I don't know, maybe it kind of got into the frame earlier when I was showing what was on the shelf, but I do have a system up there. Both these systems being 1 year old puts them at 365 days of age. That other bin up there is just past 400 days. I believe it's 404 days today. And over there, I believe we started trying to migrate the worms out of that stuff something like 100 days ago. So It's kind of a slow process. You need to be patient. Different people use different methods for hauling their worms out of their systems. Some people migrate their worms vertically through the material, like if you have sort of a flow-through system. Some people separate the worms from the contents of their systems with light, so that in time any worms that are sensing light coming down at them from above will attempt to get out of that light and submerge into the material that they're inhabiting. So some people use that as the approach to get all the worms to eventually dive down to the bottom as the material that the worms inhabit gets gradually skimmed off the top. And that's kind of one of those approaches that you can do in a single day and, you know, successfully round up almost all the worms if you're patient. But it does take a fair bit of time to wait out the worm activity, the diving of the worms down into the material. So like I said, we're going to be, you know, trying to round up the remaining worms in this material. I've even thought about maybe consolidating all the material into a single system. Perhaps dump everything into bin number 1 here, which is the somewhat larger container of the two, and then initiate some sort of a baiting of the worms out of this stuff. I don't have like a one-size-fits-all to that either as far as baiting. Sometimes I'll take old produce, plastic produce boxes or something, and try to set up a baiting station within something like that. Or I've got these other little plastic containers that are presently in use in that 404-day-old system, trying to bait worms out. So I'm not sure yet. I need to decide. But I will be doing that off camera at some point later in the day. But let's really quick, just at this point, not be attempting to haul any more worms out, but more gauge how much of a straggler population remains over here in this material. You can see as we make our way out further from where the collection area was, the material is a bit drier, and oddly enough, you do once in a while encounter a little pocket of worms. And I believe when you do find a pocket of worms huddled together in some drier material, those worms are huddling together to try to protect themselves from the dry material that they're in. So I start to get a little bit nervous when I start seeing worms exhibiting that behavior. And you know, I just can't seem to resist picking these worms out individually. But I mean, that's the sort of thing we could spend the rest of the day doing here. So I'm going to leave it at that. So please start formulating your estimate for what we just pulled out here, because that's going to be the numbers that I'm going to be looking for when you tell me how many worms you believe we released into bucket number 1. Let's make our way over into the second system so we can start hauling worms out of here too. As we did before, I'm going to just evict any worms that are on the plastic cover. Hopefully we get them all. Some of them are so small though, it's almost impossible to see them. The smallest of worms, little baby worms, they're about the size of your eyelash. So they're so easy to miss, especially when they're sitting on a piece of pink plastic like this. Alright, one more time. Let's haul out the worms that have collected over here in the feeding zone, in the horizontal migration feeding zone of bin number 2. And as we did earlier, we're going to be looking to see if we can keenly observe how many worms came together so that we can estimate how many we're going to be releasing into bucket number 2. So I'll always try to do this in such a way that really makes it easy for you as the viewer to see what's happening, so that you can give me a good informed estimate. And I mean, some people sort of put little gag estimates out there. It's like, hee, I believe it was 5 million worms and stuff. And, you know, naturally I'm not going to include anything like that into an estimate, like an averaging estimate, where I'm really looking for people to give me their honest estimates as far as how many worms we're talking about here. So I do sincerely ask that people give me realistic estimates that they truly believe are representative of what we're looking at here. Because anytime I do encounter kind of a funny sort of gag estimate that's either way too high or obviously way too low, I always feel the need to sort of probe into that situation and follow up and ask the person if it was just a typo, and could you please verify, and if it's not correct, please give me a real estimate, and blah blah blah. So I mean, I don't mind doing that, but it does become a little bit time consuming, and it would be it'd be really cool if I could just get true worm count estimates from everyone, ones that they think that are in fact about as accurate as they can be. So that last handful felt like it had a lot of worms in it. And we're almost at the limit of this little container here, so I'm glad we managed to fit them all in here. I wonder if I should have just tried to exclude those little pieces of paper towel that were in here too. They're just taking up space, but they're also kind of covered in wormies. Don't want to leave these little guys behind. So, like I said, we're going to be attempting to, round up any stragglers and get them out at a later point in time. So these castings are not being put directly to use quite yet. I'll allow for a little bit more time for rounding up the stragglers. So let's just see if we can set this cardboard divider aside briefly and just do one more quick little skim of the very edge where we, at least in bin number 1, we found little pockets of worms huddling together. So we'll try to make sure we don't miss any significant pockets of worms that were sort of right there on the edge or right on the other side of the little cardboard divider. And it is quite tempting to just sit here and attempt to pick out every single worm, but I'm going to attempt to resist the urge to do that. Although it is difficult because you look down and you see a good number of worms sort of hanging out there, and how hard is it just to reach over and grab them? Not so tough. Let's try to make this as big a haul out as possible so we can get those buckets launched with a good number of worms. I believe that these systems, when they were launched a year ago today, were also given sort of an estimated worm count, done in the same exact way as I'm trying to have happen here with this. Was, everyone's estimates were averaged, and we came up with what was thought to be approximately 1,765 worms, I believe, living in each system. I don't know why that number rings a bell. It's just what I believe I saw on my spreadsheet earlier today. Naturally, that was on day 1 when the systems were originally launched. As far as how many worms might live in here today after a year of worms potentially all breeding and attempting to increase their numbers, we could be looking at something entirely different here. So I figured I would put that out there as, a little bit of context in terms of how many worms we believe we started these bins with originally a year ago. But I think that the best way to establish an estimate is just to eyeball it, look closely at what's squirming here in front of our eyes and base our estimates on that. We'll have another chance to check them out when we release them into their new homes. But I don't want to take up too much time here. Like I said, we'll be doing some more follow-up activity in these systems, attempting to round up the stragglers, whether it's going to be consolidated into a single system and worked that way, and what type of baiting or migration area I'm going to use is still undecided. Right now I'm really more about moving on to getting these little guys released into their new home. So let's proceed with a quick examination of this material before we set it aside, and then we can proceed to the launch of the buckets. Oh my goodness, I do feel like I've got to keep this collection container here on hand to keep pulling these little guys out when I encounter another little jumble of them. I mean, we're clearly in the castings now. We're not over near the feeding area. To find little pockets of worms hanging out like that really makes me wonder, why aren't they, kind of making their way over into the collection area? It's been almost 3 weeks since we set that up for them, and it's been built to attract them. I mean, you should have seen the stuff we put into those horizontal migration feeding zones originally. There was pumpkin, there was watermelon, there were strawberry bits. We put in coffee, we put in worm chow. We dampened all the material. I mean, it was pretty much a paradise on earth for worms. So it's not surprising that we've managed to collect a good number of them. But there's always going to be those stragglers that, for whatever reason, don't kind of get the memo. Alright, this is turning into a little bit too much fun. I think it's time that we get the buckets out here and get these little guys released. And then I can proceed on to some of the off-camera work that I need to take care of here as far as getting these things reset and letting the process continue. So let me take a short break now. I just can't seem to resist pulling worms out. Perhaps I'll even pull a worm. No, I don't want to pull any out without you seeing it. So let's just try to decide that it's time to put a halt to what I'm doing here. Let's do it now. Let's stop now. And then, oh, I can't resist. Okay. Yeah, we'll leave the rest of these for another roundup that we'll initiate shortly, but I'll set these systems aside and we'll get the buckets out here and release them into their new homes. So, one more. Can't resist. Alright, onward. Okay, we're starting with the contents of what came out of bin number 1. And as you can see, we've got bucket number 1 here. So, it's time to release the worms. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be looking for everyone's comments, so please take a careful look at how many worms we're releasing here. As I usually do, I'm going to attempt to do this as gracefully as possible without spilling stuff everywhere. So let's see how this goes. I'm just looking at the size and shape of the round container, wondering how it's going to go when we get to releasing what came out of bin number 2, because that round container seems like it might be a bit too big to fit down into this container. I'm wondering if, as we're allowing these little guys to get settled in, perhaps I can move everything over out of the round container to get it into the square container so that we can do a graceful release. Alright, you know what, obviously we're not getting a good look at all the worms that were just released because there's probably a good couple inches worth of material in which there's worms everywhere. But either way, hopefully we can get some good estimates from everyone. Please don't forget to leave a comment. Let's let these little guys get settled in. Oh, here's the pumpkin stem. Then we'll get to releasing the worms into bucket number 2. I noticed a few little wormies still stuck in this transport container, so I got them all sort of rounded up together into that little pile of castings so that I could dump them out, and now I feel pretty confident that we've not left anyone behind. And yes, obviously I chickened out. I did not did not transfer the contents of the round container into the square container. I just figured we'd take our chances. Let's get bucket number 2 over here. We'll just slide over bucket number 1, get bucket number 2 in frame. So here, I guess we do the same. It does seem like it actually fits, so it was a little bit of an optical illusion making me think that maybe it wouldn't fit, but it does seem like it should be okay. let's proceed to releasing the worms into bucket number 2. Yeah, that came out quite nicely, I must say. I'll take a closer look at what might have left behind here in this container, but let's try to break up this block of material, give us a somewhat better view of how many worms we're releasing here so I can get some good solid estimates from you guys. Please don't forget to leave a comment. And once these little guys settle in, we'll be done. Alright everyone, well, that's our 2 new systems with the African nightcrawlers. A couple things that I kind of didn't do when I was placing food for them down in there was I did not include grit. So before we close up shop here, I thought it might be a good idea to introduce a little bit of grit into this system so they've got the stuff on hand if they need it. And I also thought that maybe I would sprinkle a little bit of my worm chow out on the top surface too, even though there's some coffee and potato lurking down beneath the surface waiting for them as a little snack. I thought they might appreciate some of my worm chow too. And I've still got to come up with some sort of coverings here, and I've still got to come up with some sort of approach to trying to round up the last of the worms over in the old bins, and I got some cleaning up to do and other things like that, but that stuff's all boring. I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go though really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.